So today's talk is on open source. This is the Rensselaer Center for Open Source Software, right?
Well, we remove the software.
Oh, there's no open. Okay, so it's the Rensselaer Center for Open Source. And so I realized that I don't know very much about what open source actually means, and that probably means that other people know less, and some people know more. So I decided we should do this presentation. So to start off with, we all live in the United States. The United States, like most modern countries who base their laws off the United States, has this concept of intellectual property that goes back a couple hundred years to Germany, I think. But basically, it's this thing, and it's property, which means that you can own it. Also, I'm not a lawyer. If you take this talk for legal advice, I told you you couldn't, and I'm not a lawyer, so you shouldn't. If you need a lawyer, you should find one. If I don't say that, I might be in trouble or liable for something. So basically, intellectual property is you own things that you create with your mind. That's a very bad definition, but it sort of works, and it applies to code that you write and research you do for RPI. This doesn't mean that, like, if you think up, I don't know, a math proof or something, you can instantly say it's your intellectual property. There's a lot of subtlety to this, and it's a giant legal mess. But your code is your intellectual property. So that means that you own it. And that means that if someone else wrote code, they own it, and they have all the rights unless they give it to you or something. So the other caveat to this is you own your own code unless you sign away your rights. I guarantee pretty much everyone in this room, if you've ever had a CS job, actually signed away your intellectual property rights. In some cases, you might have accidentally signed away all of them for like the next 5 years. So you should read your employment contracts. Some of them are more stringent than others. Some of them allow side projects, some of them don't. When you're getting hired, that's probably something relevant that you should discuss. Because once you've signed away all your side projects to Microsoft for the next 5 years, that's awfully hard to undo. Also, RPI owns all research, just as a side note, so that they can license out anything you do for research to other people. And I assume that doesn't apply to RCOS, or if it does, we have an exemption for open source. I actually don't know what's going on there. But I think that was handled a while ago. So how this intellectual property works, you write some code, you want other people to use it. And so there's a couple ways to do it. Most big software corporations like Microsoft, they sell you this thing called a license, which is the right for you to use Windows on your machine, but not do a whole bunch of other stuff, like resell Windows, or reverse engineer Windows, or modify Windows and create derivative works, or relicense Windows. So that's what a software license is. It's literally a license to use the software. Oddly enough, you can now license things like books via Amazon. So when you buy a book via Amazon, you're actually buying a license to read the book, which disappears when you die. Same thing with iTunes.
Yeah.
So, heads up. But there's this thing called open source. And so I'm going to start with what it is, and then we can do a little bit of history. Oh God, if you run out of seats, there's seats in the front if you want to come sit down, like Victor, and I guess that's the only one. Oh, and Kevin. See, I know 2 names. So there's this thing called the Open Source Initiative, and they have no more claim to being the correct open source definition than anyone else. Oh, there's pizza.
Wait till he's done to get pizza.
No, just get it now. We're at the beginning of the slide. Let's just go. Pizza. So we've all had pizza. So we're talking about what is open source. So this is a definition of open source from the OSI, which is a 501c3 that has a bunch of people who give it money to be the parent organization for open source, except there's like 4 other organizations that claim to be the same thing, but they have a nicer website and are slightly more popular for these sorts of presentations, which is why I chose them. They're also one of the few that actually makes a list of all open source licenses and goes through with a lawyer to figure out if they are open source or not. So that's why there's this list. So basically the idea is, so open source, you have free redistribution. This means that you get the source for the code, and you can give it to someone else. And there's no like, oh, you can have the source, but you can't send it away. What you can do is you can get Microsoft to give you the source for Windows. But anyway, basically you can share the source and you can send it all over the place. 2, you actually get the source code for the program. So you could have, theoretically, a program that's licensed under, well, not GPL, but like a quasi-open source license where all you get is the binary, which means that I guess you have a bunch of assembly and you could modify the assembly, but you can't actually recompile the program, which is sort of critical, given that binaries don't map directly to source code. And everyone likes source code much better for writing stuff. The third thing is derived works are allowed. So this means essentially derived work is like if I take GNU Emacs, and I decide that this thing is overloaded and way too fat and basically an operating system, and I write a hook so Grub can boot it directly, that would be a derived work, because I'm now creating an operating system out of Emacs. And the license is supposed to allow that. So basically this means that you can take code and you can modify it and you can produce new stuff. The integrity of author's source code, I don't know what this means, which is why I actually have this in another tab on this, if I can figure out how to get out of full screen mode. Integrity of author's source code, what does that mean? So the integrity of author's source code. Oh, so what you can do is you can say, I don't want you to modify my source, because then people might think that your really bad patches are mine, but you're allowed to distribute patches with my source. So basically, you can force people to not modify your original code, but you have to allow them to distribute your original code plus a set of patches that will programmatically modify your original code into the new code. Does that make sense to everyone? Did the other 3 points make sense?
Yeah, I think the GNU-plot plotting engine has that sort of license.
Yeah, I don't think GNU has that sort of. That's not what I meant to do. I don't think GNU has that sort of license, because if it's GNU, it probably should be launched under GPL. But maybe it is. Oh, and the style disappeared. Whatever.
GNU-plot, I don't know why it has that name, but I don't think it's affiliated with the GNU project.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's number 4. Number 5 and 6 are basically the no discrimination clauses. So you're supposed to be able to use open source software for anything, and everyone's supposed to be able to use it. Which is interesting because the ACM has a little moral clause in there. So if you write open source software that's freely distributable, you might go into conflict with your non-sworn oath as an ACM member, if anyone is an ACM member. The 7th point is you're supposed to distribute a license with your source code. So you can't have it licensed under something and then never give anyone the license, because that means it doesn't really apply. And you're also going into uncharted legal circles. 8 is that the license must not be specific to the product. So what this means is if you have some product with like a bunch of underlying open source stuff, you can't say you have an open source license to modify this code specific to like LibreOffice. So you can't pull out a LibreOffice library and use it for another project. Does that make sense to everyone? 9 is that the license must not restrict other software. So you can't make an open source license that says you can do whatever you want with this code, but I don't know, you can't install Emacs on your machine or something. That's sort of a trivial example. The last one is the license must be technology neutral. So this means that you can't have your license, I don't know, stop you from linking C code to Python, or basically be tied to the underlying technology. Does this make sense to everyone? Anyone super duper confused about some of this? Or think I explained it completely incorrectly? Or don't know what I'm talking about? Okay. If you're interested, this is all on opensource.org, I think. So the next step is going through a couple licenses that you guys will probably select. So the oldest one is called GPL, and there's some backstory to this. So this thing called GNU was launched by this guy called Richard Stallman, aka RMS, in 1983, and it was to create a free Unix distribution. Because back then you had to pay for your Unixes, or you were using Berkeley Unix or AT&T Unix. And GNU actually stands for GNU's not Unix. So it's recursive. And so they were trying to make this completely free, free as in software, free as in beer, and free as in freedom, open source distribution. And they were writing this code and they needed a license. And so they created this thing called the GNU Public License, generally referred to as GPL. I think that was actually created in 84 or 85. Right now it's on GPL version 3, so this gets updated occasionally. And the Free Software Foundation is a 501c3 that was created to, I guess, administer the license separately from GNU. So if someone's breaking GPL, you should go talk to the Free Software Foundation, not the GNU organization. Although I think they share the need of the same people. So GPL v3 is referred to as a strong copyleft by GNU. So basically what this means is you've got some code and it's GPL licensed, just plain GPL licensed. The license is attached to the code. You can basically do whatever you want with the code, but you can't relicense the code, and you can't link with non-open source code. In GPL v2, you could link with non-GPL or LGPL code, but now you just can't link with non-open source code as defined by GPL v3. So you can link with stuff like Apache or LGPL or a bunch of other, there's like 20 or so defined open source licenses. I think BSD and MIT fall under it. So basically that means if you license your library under GPL, you can't use non-open source code that's allowed with licenses not allowed by GPL, right? So if there's some library that has like the do whatever the fuck you want license, you probably can't link that into GPL v3. But if it's something more standard, you probably can. Does that make sense to everyone?
I think the key point is that you can't link to something that has, or you can't make a derived work with something that has additional restrictions.
Yeah.
So it's that you can link with anything that's less
Well,
restricted.
derived works are separate from linking. So the GPL is just basically says that you have to use GPL code and you can't use it with non-open source code. The LGPL says that you have to use GPL code, it has to stay GPL, but you can link the LGPL code as in use this library as a standalone library in something else that is proprietary. So the Linux kernel is licensed under GPL, mostly, and there are other parts that are licensed under LGPL. So like NVIDIA, when it makes binary drivers that are completely closed source for Linux, can only use the LGPL parts of the Linux kernel to build those drivers. They can't use the GPL parts. And this is actually an interesting legal debate that hasn't been solved about whether or not using an interface to a kernel counts as using the GPL or LGPL parts. But that's sort of how it works.
I was thinking like if you're using GPL code, you cannot use it for like actual product yourself for money. But if you're using LGPL code, you can actually make it
You
into
can
something.
totally use GPL code to make money, and a lot of like embedded TVs and shit use GPL code. But if you use your GPL code to make money, you have to allow people to see the modifications you made to the GPL code. You have to make them publishable, and they have to be able to modify your GPL code. So like, there's a bunch of embedded devices that use GPL code, and for a while, you could get a copy of the code, but you couldn't reflash the device to use your own modification of the GPL code, because there was like a proprietary bootloader and some encryption and some anti-modifying stuff. And there were some lawsuits over it, and it sort of got resolved, and people are sort of doing this more properly. Does that make sense?
So the GPL v3 was created
Yeah.
to prevent that.
Yeah. There's some other stuff in GPL v2, there's the software patents as well, and being compatible with more licenses.
I was about to say that about the GPL3 versus GPL2 because of that encryption preventing modification.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about GPL is you can automatically upgrade versions as long as you don't delete that clause. So something licensed under GPL 1 should theoretically be able to be relicensed under GPL 3 under the terms of the license. So that's basically the most restrictive license I'm going to talk about today. There's a couple other ones that are super common. The MIT license was created at MIT. This is the entire license. GPL is like 3 pages, which is why I didn't put it up on the screen. But basically, you can do whatever you want with the software. You know, you can copy it, modify it, merge it, use it, publish it, distribute it, sub-license it, and sell it to anyone. And you can't hold them liable for anything dumb you do with it. Does that make sense to anyone? Or everyone, I mean? People sort of get that? People are still reading it and want me to shut up? Everyone done reading it? Okay. Anyone not done? Alright, I'm just not getting live audience participation. I don't want to have to start insulting people. Not because that gets audience participation, but that's my default mode when I think people are ignoring me. So this is BSD. This is the 2-clause BSD, as opposed to the 3-clause or new BSD, which was actually created before the 2-clause BSD. This is what the BSD, or at least one of the BSD operating systems is licensed under. It's also pretty simple. Some people like it more than the MIT license. Some people like it less. It's pretty similar. You can use it however you want. It's not their problem.
Do you have to redistribute it for
Yeah, well, with all these licenses, you have to. Oh, yeah, actually, that's a good point. Because this one requires attribution. Does MIT require attribution?
I don't think so.
Why don't you go back? That's a good question.
Scroll back. I don't think it does.
It's MIT.
Oh yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, all these licenses require you to keep the license in with the software, because these are all OSI approved, and that's one of the OSI tenets. There's a couple other licenses. The Apache license, I'm not including because it's really long. It's pretty similar to the MIT or BSD license. It was created originally for the Apache web server, which then turned into the Apache project, which now has like 20 open source projects under it. The interesting distinction about it is that that's actually a problem with it. With it,
That was what made it incompatible with GPL v2.
it is
was
compatible with
GPL
v3. what's interesting about it is that most of these licenses, there's nothing about saying if you submit code, we assume you're licensing it under this license. With Apache, if you submit a software patch to an Apache project, in the license it says that we assume that you are waiving all your rights to bitch about us licensing us under Apache. So with Apache, contributions are theoretically auto-licensed into Apache, whereas with the other licenses, that's not made explicit. Although it sort of is implicit because you gave the code back to the open source organization. And in GPL, it's forced. But that's an interesting thing. There's a couple other licenses that I like to talk about. Beerware was created in opposition to the GPL license in '84. And the license is you can do whatever you want as long as if you see me in a bar, you buy me a beer. And if you
Awesome.
yeah, it's also not open source, but at least not OSI approved. It's also 4 lines. And this was permissive license. Maybe there's like a you want in the middle of there. And it's almost equivalent to releasing it into the public domain, but not quite as technically licensed. I also don't think it's ever stood up in court. Oh, that's why those windows are showing up. I'm not in presentation mode.
Wow, Colin.
Well, I also can't see my mouse.
You're so unprofessional.
Got it. So why am I telling you all this? So, ooh, those 3 words weren't supposed to be capitalized. I don't know what happened there. I also don't know why those words are off the screen. This is a really well-made presentation. It worked 30 minutes ago. So the point is, everyone in here, if you're making open source software, you should decide on a license. If you don't know what you're doing, I recommend you choose one of the preceding free licenses after reading about it a little bit, or talk to your mentors, because they might know what they're doing. They should know what they're doing. And then you need to actually put the license into your code after you chose one. Generally, this means you make a license file, and then you put some sort of smaller thing at the top of a resource code file. But all of these licenses, for the most part, have descriptions attached to them that say how you actually can correctly add this to your code. So like GPL v3, you put it in the license file, and then you put like a little header on all of your files that says, this code's licensed under GPL v3, copyright blah, 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 blah from these years. You should have been distributed with a license in the license file. If not, contact the Free Software Association to get them to sue someone. So that's it. Does everyone understand sort of the point of this whole presentation now? Anyone really lost or just doesn't want to follow the license? Okay. So there's a bunch of caveats to this. First, once you license something, you can't change it, sort of. So if you change it, you have to get permission from all the copyright holders to relicense it, which is interesting because you don't actually get the code, you just get a license to use the code in a specific way. And so what this might mean is if you've got 20 contributors and you decide to change from like MIT to BSD, you're going to actually have to track down all 20 of them and get them to say okay. Or your change is technically not allowed, or a violation of the license, which is hilarious. And perhaps legally not so hot. You also should, put should in there with quotes, because I'm not a lawyer, and if this actually like comes up in a big way, you should probably talk to a lawyer. But you should generally make sure that people agree with your license to contribute. I did this more with BitHopper because I actually was going to relicense it, so I had to make sure everyone either released stuff in the public domain or was okay with me relicensing them or something else. But just sort of realize that that should be in there somewhere, even if it's just in the README. And the last one is that there's a whole other wonderful world of software law in the United States that gets complicated. Like software patents, I'm not even going to talk about. That's a horrendously complicated matter. And there's also these things called contributor license agreements that big software companies that have open source projects tend to use. And there's also some moderate to large debate about whether or not those are open source and what they mean. An additional slide that might be useful to you is if someone just sued you with regards to open source and IP stuff, also known as you need an open source IP lawyer and you're a poor college student, you have some friends. So the FSF, they own GPL, so if someone sues you over GPL stuff, they might provide a lawyer or be interested in the lawsuit because they would love to try this stuff in court and get a court decision which makes it more legally binding in the United States. The OSI is the parent open source organization, and I doubt they will give you a lawyer. They don't have that much money, but they might know someone who's interested in helping. So that's useful. The EFF is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Freedom Foundation?
Frontier.
Frontier Foundation. And they do a lot of interesting stuff. But one of the things they do is they want to try open source patents in court, mostly GPL, I think, but some other ones. So if you get sued, they might be interested in making this a landmark legal victory for the freedom of open source organization. And they have money and lawyers and yeah, and they're like currently running like 3 lawsuits against the United States for mass pregnant spying
And net neutrality.
and net neutrality.
They're everywhere. Right
Yeah.
now.
So also, if you have free money, you should give some to it. But they're sort of the good guy lawyers, and they might give you a lawyer, particularly if you get sued for open source stuff, because they're very interested in that. Also, the open source organizations might also be able to help. So like if you get sued because you use the Apache license, Apache probably has something to say about that, and they know lawyers. And that's also true if you're using licenses from other organizations. So that's another thing to think about. So that's the end of the presentation. Thanks to Professor Morphy, Professor Goldschmidt, Sean O'Sullivan, and all of you guys for showing up and listening to this. Are there any questions? Whew, only 2.
So are we expected to only use open source initiative approved licenses for any RCOS code, or can we do public domain?
I mean, public domain is probably totally fine. So here's the thing, is that there's actually a debate about this, and there might be some people in the room who have strong opinions about we should only use GPL software, aka strong copyleft licenses. Some people might want weak copyleft, some people might want permissive, and some people might want to just put it all in the public domain or use the beer license or whatever. And there probably is some sort of decision we can make as a group. I am much more concerned about people not putting any license on their code than I am about what license you choose, as long as it is vaguely open source. If you write something huge that you think people will use, I'd much rather you put it under like BSD or MIT or GPL than the beer license. But that's a debate that has much more overarching considerations than I'm willing to make in a 3-minute answer to a question. So pick a license,
Yeah.
and you're okay.
Isn't there something special that happens if you don't put any license on your code?
Yeah, no one can use it.
No one is allowed to use it.
I mean, no one has a license to do anything with it. Although if you
So-
publish it, there's sort of an implicit license for people to read it, but really it just turns into a giant legal mess. And if you
Yeah.
ever want to do anything with it, there's going to be a lawsuit involved to figure out the status of it. There's also some things about like abandoned works and that sort of thing. But I'm not a lawyer. You should talk to a real lawyer.
Thanks, Dave.
No thanks.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Just add licenses to your code.
Yeah. Preferably open source licenses. And we're going to yell at you if you add like Microsoft's licenses. And if you do something that's not OSI approved, we're going to raise some eyebrows and probably be a little confused. Okay.
2 questions. First question is, so it sounds like if I release a part of code, but I don't attach any license to it, it means like if anyone uses it, I can sue them for using my code.
So your lawsuit would not have very much grounds to stand on because you released your code and you didn't say how you wanted it to be used. On the flip side, if a corporation uses your code, their lawyers are going to flip a shit fit on them. You have to call this guy and get an actual license. So it's a legal gray area, and the point is if you're writing open source code, you don't want to be in a legal gray area because you want people to use your code. And it's not open source, it isn't a legal gray area. Honestly, this is a lawyer question. If you're doing like research, you probably can't license your code under open source because RPI owns it. And you should talk to an RPI lawyer about how you're allowed to publish your code. I don't know. I also read the research policy at RPI, which I don't think anyone else in here has done.
Doesn't it include the
Oh, Stuart has. Kudos to you. So RPI actually has a large policy about like what you own in your code, what you're allowed to release, what you're allowed to publish, who owns the copyright. And if you're doing research, you should read that and talk to RPI's lawyers because it's their job. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the second question is like, before you say like, if you're using part of like Apache code, you're like automatically agree with like your code will be using their license.
So there's 2 answers to this.
Yeah.
With Apache code, what it actually means is if you submit a patch to the Apache project, I don't know, adding like HTTP 2 protocol beta support or Spidey support or whatever, like the Apache web server, which is licensed under the Apache license. The Apache license says if you submit code to us, you are giving us the right to license your code under Apache version 2.0, blah, blah, blah. So that's what it says. Now, if you've never read the license and you don't know how the Apache web server is licensed, I don't know how legally binding that is, but it is in a license. So that's the first part. The second part is that, what?
No, I'm kind of confused.
Basically,
The Apache license is copyleft or no?
so the Apache license has this little, I'm just going to pull it up now. I'm not going to pull it up, I can't use the screen. So the Apache license has a clause that says if you submit code to us, you agree to license it under Apache.
Oh, if you submit the code to them.
Yeah, so that's all it says.
But you're allowed to publish patches separately, not submitted directly to them under like an all-permissive license or the GPL.
I have no idea, you should talk to a lawyer about that. But the Apache project, the Apache license specifically says that if you submit code to this project, you give us the right to have it licensed under Apache. Whereas everything else, technically it's not there, but you're giving them the code, so it's sort of implicit, and you should talk to a lawyer if you actually are super concerned about this. This second half to that question is the Apache license actually says you give them the right to use any code you've created for all time for this project, which may in fact be A, legally unpermissible, and B, not possible. It's like if I'm a fictitious company employee, my employment contract might state that they get all code that's developed on fictitious company property or during their time, and I have to tell them about all code I write that's not either of those, so they know that it's not theirs. And in that case, if I contribute code to an Apache licensed project, I actually can't give them the right to use all code I've ever produced under an Apache license, which means that the license is sort of flawed, because it really should just refer to the code you gave them. Does that make sense? Did I just confuse the problem more?
Okay, and you said like the RPI on oral research?
Well, I read the agreement a while ago when I did research, and I assume RCOS has some sort of understanding, and now I'm not even sure if this counts as a research project. But RPI does have a copyright policy, and when you're doing research at RPI, you're expected to retain all your lab notebooks and retain all your data and that sort of thing so that you can support a copyright statement, suit, whatever, and you're supposed to retain it for a couple of years, and they also get the right to sell the technology or relicense it. You should honestly read the research agreement and talk to their lawyers. I haven't looked at this in 2 years, and I don't do research anymore, so I'm not as concerned about it. But you should seriously, also if you're doing research, there's a grad professor or a professor, and he should probably know what's going on. And if he doesn't, that might be a warning sign, and that might mean you should go talk to a lawyer. Got it. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
That was your second question, right? So
Yeah.
you're good? Okay.
So going back to the public domain stuff, if you want to release it under public domain, you should probably release it under Creative Commons 0. Because there's some companies that, or there's still some countries that have an implicit copyright even if you release it into the public domain. And the 0 license kind of fixes that.
So I'm going to contradict everything you just said and say never release your code under Creative Commons, because Creative Commons has a giant statement about why they hate it when people do this, and it's not legally correct and not legally binding, and you shouldn't fucking do it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you can actually dual license code that you create. So if you're super concerned about this, you can release code in the public license and then also release it under the NIT license or something like that, if you're concerned about it.
Yep.
Which would be my recommendation, because Creative Commons hates it when people release code under Creative Commons.
All right, I figured that was that's what the 0 license was for, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also am not a lawyer. You should talk to a lawyer if you're actually worried about this.
Yes.
That is the subtext of this entire conversation. Got it.
Something potentially amusing, potentially scary about RPI's policy, I'm pretty sure it includes the literal phrase "throughout the universe" to refer to something about Rensselaer's ownership of our intellectual property or something like that.
I mean, I haven't read the policy recently, so. Anyone else? Any other questions? How long did that take?
40 minutes.
Holy shit. Well.